Right. Let's now move in this class or from this class to the third sub-theme in the first section of our course, section 1C, which is called Exploring Context of Theory and Theorizing. And this broadly corresponds to PPT 3 that has been shared with you. And I will get on with this. The reading for this, is chapter 1 of Richard Swedberg's Theorizing in Social Science, the Context of Discovery. And I will, I'm sure some of you would have read it already, but I'm not going to traverse entirely, that introductory chapter in that Swedberg book. But I'm using some of the comments made by Richard Swedberg as a kind of a takeoff for context of exploring context of theory and theorizing, right? I think I've identified certain key terms or key vocabularies in this set of lectures, and I will take you through some of these key terms and vocabularies in the context of this lecture, right? Let me begin with a quotation from Swedberg, and this is outlined in the preface to his edited book, Theorizing in Social Science, the Context of Discovery, right? Which was published in 2014. And I'm quoting Richard Swedberg. Incidentally, Richard Swedberg is an interesting contemporary sociologist, social theorist, who has some extremely interesting contributions in economic sociology, right? In fact, I remember as a student or as a researcher reading his book of interviews with economists and sociologists called, I think, Conversations with Economists and Sociologists. And it was a fascinating book of a set of interviews with economists who open out to sociology and sociologists who open out to economists, to economics, etc. So I think his moorings begin there, although prior to that, some of his writings are on Weber and so on. Then he moves into questions of theory and theorizing, the question of the prospects of Weber's theory, theorizing, and so on. So his contributions have been basically, in the methodology of social theory, in economic sociology, and so on, right? But I'm referring only to this work, and I'm only a part of this work, although the book itself has some interesting contributions by others, right? Okay, so let me go to this quote from Richard Swedberg. Okay, and he's defining what is the purpose of that book, which he edited, called Theorizing in Social Science, the Context of Discovery. The purpose of this book is to start a discussion of the need for more creative theorizing in social science, right? So please note this, theorizing in social science, and that he wants to lay the basis for more creative theorizing in social science. I continue the quotation. We need better and bolder theory, right? And the key to producing this better and bolder theory lies in the way theory is being produced and how it is being taught to the next generation of social scientists, right? And I continue, right? So he's somewhere trying to argue that there is something called as theory and there is something called as theorizing, and there is a need for if you want to be creative in theory, then it's important that we focus on theorizing in social science, right? So as he puts it, that the key to producing better and bolder theory, okay, lies in the process of theorizing, right? So theory is the product, and theorizing is the process that leads to that product, right? So, and I quote again, in order to end up with better theory, right, in brief, we need to shift our concern from theory to theorizing, right? I mean, and the quotation is explicit in trying to, shift the focus of a lot of social science engagement from just the task of tackling theories to actually creatively producing theories, right, etc. Okay, so you can see that the passage that he's talking for or urging is that we need to move from theory to theorizing, right? Okay, now there is a reason why Swedberg is keen to mediate the shift from theory to theorizing. Okay, because according to him, notwithstanding the advance in the kinds of methods that social sciences use, okay, the ways of handling theory has not kept pace with the advance in research methods and the kinds of methods that social scientists use. Okay, so in other words, there is an uneven development of methods and theory, right? And this uneven development of methods and theory, according to Swedberg, needs to be bridged. And one way of bridging this divide between methods and theory, right, is by shifting the focus from theory to theorizing, right, etc. Okay. Okay. Now that's why I mean, for clearly that for what Swedberg is arguing for in moving from theory to theorizing is to bridge the uneven development of methods and theory, right? Also to lay the basis for more creative theories and so on, right? Okay, now in fact, let's stay with Swedberg for the moment, because I'm going to depart from Swedberg as we move along. Okay, but for the moment, I'm staying with Swedberg and the ideas that he has articulated in the reading that I've shared with you, right? Now, in fact, according to Swedberg, okay, the expression to theorize, okay, refers to what one does to produce a theory, right? Or rather, the thought process, okay, that underlies a theory, right? I mean, okay. So to theorize is what is required for producing a theory, the thought process before one is ready to consider a theory as final or as a product, and so on. That's why clearly he's talking of theorizing as a process and theory as an end product, right, etc. Okay, and I think this is very clear in what he is arguing, right? In fact, according to Swedberg, the theory and theorizing, belong together and complement each other, right? But if you want to have more creative theories, then you have to be attentive to the processes of theorizing, as he puts it, etc. Okay. Okay. Now, in fact, according to Swedberg, this preoccupation with theory, or this focus mainly on theory, which is, according to him, the main concern today, that this preoccupation with theory actually implies, right, that the way in which a theory is actually produced gets neglected, right? And he believes that this neglect of theorizing and the overemphasis on the product theory, is true both for is true both for individual researchers as indeed for social science research as a whole, right? And that's why that even as we look at theories and theories, what Swedberg is saying, right, is that the ways in which theory or theories are actually produced also need to be attended to, right? In fact, for Swedberg, this neglect of theorizing and the overemphasis on theory as product and the neglect of theorizing as process has much to do with the tendency, according to him, to ignore what is called the context of discovery, and focus instead on the context of justification, right? Now, this distinction between context of discovery and context of justification is a certain technical distinction, and I will soon attend to it. But according to Swedberg, and I'm just posing the argument, if the focus on theory has to be complemented by an equal focus on theorizing, then it is important that you take the context of discovery, that's what theorizing relates to, more seriously and more equally emphatically with the product, the theory, or which is often the context of justification. I'll explain these terms because these are technical terms, and I will explain this because there is a history to that distinction, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on the terms of that distinction, etc. But I'm just outlining that for Swedberg, if the focus has to shift from theory to theorizing, then this overemphasis on the context of justification has to be set aside, and there has to be an equal emphasis placed on what is called the context of discovery. Now, as I say it in my PPT, etc. The way in which this issue is being posed seems somewhat absolute, right? That we need to move from theory to theorizing, from the context of justification to the context of discovery, and so on, right? So there is something absolute or absolutist, if one were to see it as such, in what Swedberg is postulating as the way forward for discussions on theory and methods to proceed. That this uneven development of theory and methods needs to be bridged, and this bridging can come by an equal emphasis as much on the context of justification as on the context of theorizing, right? Now, I think it's important for us to engage with these terms, right? Which Swedberg's discussion is setting up for us: theory, theorizing, context of discovery, context of justification, process, product, etc. Right? And that's what I will be doing in what we are in the ways in which we proceed along this line. Right? Now, let me give some background to that distinction between context of discovery and context of justification. I mean, just to recall, Swedberg is saying that in reclaiming theorizing, you're reclaiming the context of discovery, right? In overemphasizing theory, right, as product, you are actually, in a sense, overemphasizing the context of justification, right? So there is some kind of an improper balance, as it were, and that this balancing exercise is crucial, both for theory and for theorizing, and so on. That is the terms that broadly what Swedberg is alerting us to. Right now, I think it's important to allude to the background to this distinction between context of discovery and context of justification, and I think it's an extremely interesting distinction. Okay, and there are. There are many ways in which that distinction can be deployed, independent of the history that attaches to that distinction. Okay, and in my own work, I have often found it useful to be deploying that distinction in spite of its history, right? And its genealogy and so on. So I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the context of this class on the distinction itself between context of discovery and context of justification. And I'm sure some of you who have gone through courses in theory, or at least in methods, or in the philosophy of social science, would have been privy to some of these conversations and so on, right? But nevertheless, I think it's important to revisit those conversations that we have had as part of our own trajectory through the philosophy of social science, or through our engagement with methods and so on. Right now, this distinction between context of discovery and context of justification received its most influential formulation in the early part of the 20th century, around the 1930s, right? Essentially through the work of Hans Reichenbach, right? Okay, and I've mentioned it in the PPT. Okay, and it also gets some kind of articulation, not very explicit, but very much there in the philosophy of science of Karl Popper, right? And I'm quite sure a lot of students would be familiar with the outpourings of Karl Popper, whether it be in the philosophy of science, or in the criterion of scientific truth, or in the idea of a critical rationalism, or in the idea of challenging some of the orthodoxies that go into historicist modes of thought coming from Plato, Hegel, Marx, and so on, right, etc. Okay, so I think the historical context in which this distinction participates is the 1930s context, when a lot of philosophers of science are engaging with both the history and philosophy of science, right? And Hans Reichenbach is one influential figure in that context, and in a sense, that distinction gets refined in the work of Karl Popper, right? Important to remember that both these scholars, Hans Reichenbach and Karl Popper, are interested in strengthening the foundations, the methodological foundations of science, right? And when they invoke that distinction between context of discovery and context of justification, they had the natural sciences as the model in mind, okay, and not the social sciences, right, etc. Okay, and you can clearly see that what Swedberg is doing is to extend the terms of that polarity to the social sciences as well. Okay, but that's just a passing comment, and I'm not going to make too much of it anyway. In fact, in my own register of things, this distinction between natural sciences and social sciences will have to be redrawn. Okay, and the ways in which the sociological tradition, coming through Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and then moving into sociological theory after 1945, I think there are some gross simplicities that are part of that theater, and I think we need to move beyond the ways. In fact, if you remember, I had referred to a small exchange between Charles Taylor and Thomas Kuhn, where Thomas Kuhn, commenting on an iconic essay by Charles Taylor, Interpretation and the Sciences of Man. This latter essay we will be looking in the next segment of our course, actually argues, Kuhn argues that while the distinction between natural sciences and social sciences is important, the key question is, where do you draw it and how do you draw it, right? I mean, and Kuhn himself said that just because interpretation dominates the human sciences or the social sciences doesn't necessarily mean that the interpretative languages are not crucial to sciences and so on, right? So I think there is a larger context in which this discussion can be pushed, but I think in the context in which, say, Reichenbach and Popper were playing with that distinction, they were trying to consolidate the methodological foundations of science and doing so primarily with the natural sciences in mind and not the social sciences, right? Incidentally, the distinction between context of discovery and context of justification is still looms large in the literature, is still around us, okay? Although it was, as I said, invoked in the 30s and so on, and also very much critiqued in the philosophy of science subsequently by people like Paul Feyerabend and others. Nevertheless, the distinction, I think, is still around, and the very fact that Swedberg, writing in 2014, invokes it and then justifies theorizing through the focus on the context of discovery is clearly implying that the distinction is still around, okay? But the point is, the distinction has been criticized over the years and is far from being generally accepted, right? Etc. Okay, so given this background, let me move into what are these terms: context of discovery, context of justification, as announced by Hans Reichenbach and later refined by Karl Popper, imply. What do they imply? Now, the context of discovery, right, has to do with as it specifies, the context of discovery has to do with the generation of an idea, the production of an idea, right, or a hypothesis or a theory sketch. Okay, okay. So there is some kind of a context in which an idea takes shape or a hypothesis announces itself, right, etc. Okay, so there is some kind of a history, okay, underlying the production of ideas, right, or the articulation of an idea or a theory sketch or a hypothesis and so on. And so the context of discovery, okay, at least in the terms in which Hans Reichenbach instituted that distinction, refers to the generation of an idea, the production of an idea, okay, and more importantly, Reichenbach, as indeed later Popper, implied and emphasized that the context of discovery can and must be approached merely and essentially as a empirical matter, right, etc. Right? That means to say, to address the context of discovery is to address a certain factual ground, okay, which underlies a certain idea, right? How an idea got to be made, what is the context in which it shaped up, how it presented itself, and so on. So it's an empirical matter, an empirical historical matter involving a certain factual ground describing what went into the making of the idea or a hypothesis or a theory sketch. Okay, okay. So as an empirical matter, it is it is the source of a description, right? And the content of that description, okay, can be a historical event, right, or a process, or even a norm which produces an idea, right? So it could be an event or a process or a norm, which or a guideline or a rule, okay, which triggers a certain idea or a certain hypothesis to take shape, and so on, right? In fact, in parenthesis, I note in my PPT that Reichenbach himself defined the context of discovery as the form in which thinking processes are subjectively performed, right? And it was very clear that natural science cannot address these processes in a satisfactory way, right? In fact, as Reichenbach put it, the act of discovery escapes logical analysis, right? And science, or the idea of science as a form of logical analysis, okay, as a form of logical analysis, cannot adequate to this content, to this descriptive content, this factual ground, okay? Alternatively, Popper, similarly argued, okay, that everything that precedes the formulation of a theory, okay, is of no interest to science, right? So how a theory got to be made, what is the background to a theory, is something that science is not interested in, okay, or science as a form of logical analysis. In fact, the background to a theory, what precedes the formulation of a theory, actually belongs, at best, Popper believed, to empirical psychology, right, etc. And it's not the domain of science per se, right, etc. Okay, right. In fact, you can clearly see that in the instituting context of this distinction, context of discovery and context of justification, the context of discovery, is seen as something that science cannot address. Science as a form of logical analysis cannot address, and it cannot account for, it cannot move into the study. Science cannot become a study of what accounts for the emergence of ideas or theories or theoretical creativity per se, right? Rather, the only place for science, the only domain of scientific inquiry is the context of justification, right? Okay, so you can clearly see that when Reichenbach and Popper were articulating the terms of the distinction, they were clearly setting up a possibility that scientific analysis is essentially about not the context of discovery, but the context of justification, right? So what is the context of justification? Now, alternatively, the context of justification has to do with the assessment of the plausibility of an idea, right, or a hypothesis or a theory sketch, okay, and therefore includes or incorporates the critical idea of testing and acceptance, right? So the focus in the context of justification is what justifies the theory, not the history. The history will not justify it. Whether the theory or a hypothesis can withstand our testing procedures, right, etc. Right. So you find the context of justification is the context involving the testing of a theory or an idea or a hypothesis, and so on, right? I mean, what are the grounds for accepting a particular hypothesis? What are the grounds for rejecting a particular hypothesis, etc.? And so on. Okay, so you can clearly see that while the context of discovery is seen as an empirical matter, a matter of historical description, or some kind of a scientific, some kind of an empirical psychology, the context of justification, at least in the ways in which Reichenbach and Popper were arguing, implied that it is a logical matter. It's I mean, the context of justification is a logical matter. Okay, it involves certain normative criteria of appraisal. It involves certain protocols of testing a theory, right? So a hypothesis can be termed as valid, right, or will get invalidated if it does not succumb to some of the testing protocols, or normative criteria appraisal, okay, and therefore it clearly moves beyond a descriptive factual ground, right, etc. Okay, that's why, I mean, and I quote Reichenbach in the handout that has been given to you, right, that the context of justification refers, and it's quoted there, the form in which thinking processes are communicated to other persons. Okay, and he maintained, Reichenbach maintained that the form in which thinking processes are communicated to other persons can be addressed by science in a particular kind of a way, right, etc. So, in fact, there are interesting stories of scientific discoveries which actually point out to the the fertility of this distinction, right? I mean, there are, I mean, the famous Indian mathematician Srinivas Ramanujam, whenever he postulated his proof, I mean, he devised his mathematical formulations, etc. Many times he would justify a mathematical formulation and the proof that he gave of it, saying that it came in a dream, or the goddess appeared to him and gave him the proof, and so on. Now it was Ramanujam's Srinivas Ramanujam's encounter with Thomas Hardy, the mathematician, that changed the terms of the equation, right? And what Hardy was recognizing was that there is a mathematical genius in Ramanujam, but that genius needs to be harnessed through and rooted through the protocols of the context of justification, right? You cannot justify a mathematical theory saying that it appeared to me in a dream, or the goddess came to me and gave me this or something of that kind, right? So you need to have systematic normative criteria underlying the proof, and a lot of it, I mean, this has been captured in books. In fact, Ashish Nandi has a book on this, on the alternative sciences, particularly looking at Ramanujam, J.C. Bose, and others from the Indian context, as indeed there are other works which engage with this question, right? Okay, that's why the form in which thinking processes are communicated to other persons, right? I mean, that implies that there is a certain set of protocols that you need to observe if an observation translates as a scientific theory or a scientific comment or something of that kind, right? So you can clearly see that there is a certain history to that distinction, context of discovery, context of justification, and that there is a tendency within the history and philosophy of science, okay, or discussions within the history and philosophy of science, to emphasize one over the other, right? So once you have dismissed the context of discovery as an empirical matter, non-logical, and biographical, historical, psychological, then somewhere you need to argue that the object of science being logic, being precision, etc. You need to address how these things can be measured and so on. So you can clearly see that the overemphasis on the context of justification went with a certain discounting of the process of the context of discovery. Are there any doubts or clarifications at this point? Any doubts, any clarifications? Okay, so I mean, I think the silences cannot linger for too long. I mean, in a one-to-one class, I think our silences are all filled up, in other ways. But in this online mode, the silences can be huge gaps in the digitized data that is there, and so on. So I need to fill up all those little digital spaces of the recording with content as much as possible. So, right. Okay. Now, clearly, and there are a lot of problems associated with that distinction, and there are also deep-seated ambiguities underlying that distinction between context of discovery and context of justification. And I will come to that soon. Okay. Yet there is something in the distinction which can serve as a useful point of departure along the lines suggested by Swedberg, right? Okay. I mean that if you for Swedberg, if you have to move from theory to theorizing, from the product to the process that leads to the product, then somewhere along the way, you need to move from the context of justification to the context of discovery, right? So there is some logical framework within which, some plausibility attaching to Swedberg's argument, etc. Although in the rest of the lecture, it's not a route I'm going to take on the question of theory and theorizing in the social sciences, etc. And I will take a different route, but I'm not discounting the route that ROUTE, the route that Swedberg is taking, right? Okay. Now, so there is something useful. However problematic the distinction is, and there are deep ambiguities that underlie the distinction, there is still something useful, and that use is kind of attested to by Swedberg's remarks, right? Okay. Now, Swedberg is not discounting the context of justification. In fact, he constantly argues that there is much to be learned about ways of developing and testing theories, ideas, hypotheses, and so on. And these are all part of the context of justification. But according to Swedberg, it is equally important, okay, to understand what precedes these operations of testing, of justifying your statements, your theories, your hypotheses, and ideas, and so on, right? In fact, according to Swedberg, the focus on logical matters, on cognitive components, is important to theorizing. Okay, no doubt about it. So the context of justification is important for the act of theorizing, right? Okay, but equally important are what belongs to the domain of discovery, namely issues of intuition, issues of imagination, issues of creativity, conceptual innovation, and so on. And that's precisely what Hardy sees in Ramanujam, right? And whole of Hardy's effort is to kind of harness that creative impulse, the genius that is Ramanujam, and then package it, present it in a form which is understandable and communicable to the scientific community at large, right? So issues of imagination, issues of intuition, conceptual creativity, innovation, etc., equally have their place, and a lot of this can exist within the domain of the context of discovery, right? Etc. So Swedberg's argument is a useful deployment of the terms of this distinction, right? I will come to the ambiguities and other things later on, right? And I think it's important to get on with the terms of this distinction. So in fact, my final slide is actually returning to the distinction between context of discovery and context of justification, and I make some loud remarks at that point, right? Now let me move to the next slide, which is which I have termed it as further exploring the context of theory and theorizing. And I'm kind of trying to move away from the terms of the discussion as set by Richard Swedberg here, right? I'm not discounting the force and the urgency of the questions that Swedberg has raised for us, and there is something interesting and convincing about what he is arguing for, right? But I want to engage with another ground of discussion, and that's where you will have to so that's why even as you read the readings that have been shared with you in class, shared through the Google Classroom, I think it's also equally important that you either attend class or listen to the lecture and try to find your way through it, right? And that's where I think the lecture is as much a modality in the learning exercise as the readings are, and the lecture is not just reproducing the reading, it's also trying to forge alternative pathways between and across readings and so on. And I think this is a critical move that I have constantly deployed as part of my pedagogic exercise, and I think there is a story to be told about it as well, right? But I don't think you all are in the mood for stories, and this medium doesn't allow for too much of storytelling, etc. But let me move into other ways of exploring the context of theory and theorizing, right? Okay, and please note, there are other ways of exploring the context of theory and theorizing, and for one, for one, the absoluteness of that distinction between context of discovery and context of justification has to be confronted, right? Okay, I will sound out these ambiguities. Now a little more quickly, but I will address them more fully later in the light of what we have been discussing and so on. But I think it's important to explore other contexts of discovering exploring context of theory and theorizing, And one critical point of departure for us is the sheer absoluteness of the distinction between context of discovery and context of justification, which has to be confronted, right? I mean, there are a lot of ambiguities attaching to the distinction. For one, and as I note in passing, the word discovery, right? If you look at the word discovery, many times the common usage of the word discovery includes some sort of justification, right? Etc. So whenever we say this is the truth, right, etc., we often justify it by saying that no, I was witness to it, and so on, right? So whenever we assert something, we are also setting up a certain justification or a ground on which that assertion is justified, right? Etc. So in our common usage, discovery does include aspects of justification. It's quite, of course, in the technical sense, somebody might say, no, justification is quite different from discovery. But in the everyday sense, there is a sense in which one can argue that our usage, when we say that we have discovered something, we are also, in a sense, committing to a certain procedure for establishing it, and so on, right? Secondly, and I'm going through this a little quickly, I'll return to this a little towards the end again, that discovery, what we call discovery, can involve logical aspects, right? And both Reichenbach and Popper believed that it's only justification which involves logical aspects, and the discovery is an empirical psychological matter, right? But surely discovery can also involve logical aspects, even as justification can have certain etc. Okay. In fact, you read scientists, for instance. You read scientists. There is a lot of theorizing in science which doesn't have a factual ground. Okay, and sometimes a theory which does not have a factual ground is still accepted, right? Because it seems very elegant. It enables them to do other things. And so on, right? I mean, you should read this. This enjoyable autobiography of this famous Nobel physicist Richard Feynman, right? And the title is called "Surely You Must Be Joking, Mr. Feynman," right? And you will find that this man's science was not just built on on laboratory and testing and so on. It was also built on a certain disposition towards the world, towards others that were part of his scientific quest, as it were, right? And so on. So the arena of justification can also involve empirical, sociological, and psychological aspects. In fact, in a lot of discussions about science, in fact, in the more expansive version of the course, I actually deal with different, ideas about science, right? What does it mean to be scientific, and so on, and different ideas about what it means to be to be doing science or to be scientific, and that answer to that question has shifted over time, and increasingly today. Science is seen to obtain within a community, and it is a form of practice, right? Of course, as a form of practice, is not just quite like any other form of practice, but distinctive, and the scientific community is also distinctive. So, but nevertheless, there is a recognition of certain sociological aspects that are part of the repertoire of scientific discoveries, and so on. Right? I mean, you read Kuhn, or you read, other figures. They clearly establish this fact. right, etc. Okay. Likewise, I mean, I'm kind of traversing this a little quickly because I want to move to our own context of exploring the context of theory and theorizing. You can raise questions about the context of discovery being strictly a factual matter. Okay. And I mean, that distinction that context of discovery is a factual matter and context of justification is a logical and normative matter, that distinction itself can be critical, can be criticized, okay, because that distinction seems to be implying that the factual has nothing to do with the normative, right? Okay, and surely in the context of our course, when I go into the evaluative basis of science and of social science, I will actually be engaging with this ground of what is the relationship between the factual and the normative. What is the relationship between science and values? Science as a domain of fact, and values as a domain of desirability, of politics, and so on, right? So there is clearly the very distinction that one is a factual matter and the other is a logical and a normative matter is problematic, because a lot of the time, the factual can incorporate the normative, just as the normative may underwrite our engagement with the ground of facts, and so on. I will be discussing this question a little more systematically later in the course. Actually, we'll be anchoring that discussion through this pioneering essay of Weber, which hopefully all of you would have read, on objectivity in science and social policy, right? I mean, that path-breaking essay by Weber. I mean, there is an interesting history to that essay. I will speak about that later. And Weber was actually saying that the factual and the normative should not be confused with each other, right? And that these are two separate domains of engagement, and that science, social science, is essentially about the domain of facts, empirical facts, and not the domain of value or judgments on those facts, and so on. But surely there is a lot of problems associated with the claim that the factual has nothing to do with the normative. And I think as the course proceeds, we will engage with this ground, not necessarily in the context of discovery, context of justification distinction, but independent of it later. But the distinction itself, context of discovery, context of justification, is built around some kind of a binary between the domain of facts and the domain of values, right? Okay, and that science is essentially the domain of facts, and the context of justification is essentially engaging with testing the ground of those facts, and so on, right? So I think it's given that in exploring other contexts of discovery, other contexts of theory and theorizing, we are taking for granted that the distinction, context of discovery, context of justification, however useful and critical it is for Richard Swedberg and others, nevertheless, I think there is it's important for us to open out to the sheer limits of that distinction in the ways I've already suggested, right? And I think in setting up an alternative ground of discussion, let me make some initial admissions, right? I mean, what we call theory or even theorizing is itself a contested concept, right? Etc. And I mean, in fact, all through, I have resisted the temptation to define a theory or or the act of theorizing. I mean, to give a definition to theory and theorizing, etc. Although, if you're looking at the sociological tradition, especially the instituted professionalized sociological tradition that comes after 1945, or in the context of 1945, in the context of developments in the 30s and the 40s, you will find that there are certain protocols that go into this professionalization, and there are definitions given about what is sociological theory or what is theory, and so on. But I think definitions don't define. I mean, the definitions are very particular maneuvers to a theory or a theorist, and I think we need to be aware that any definition of theory or theorizing is a particular maneuver, right? And you cannot be universalized, right? So given that theory or theorizing is itself a contested concept, okay, clearly there can be different ways of thinking about theory and theorizing, right? And what Swedberg is suggesting is only one way, perhaps an interesting way, neat and complete, of thinking about theory and theorizing in the context of the social sciences. In fact, as I mentioned in the handout that has been given to you, if you look at the etymology of the word theory, right? I mean, in Greek and in the Greek or Latin as theoria, right? The etymology of the word theory can be traced back to the Greek word theoria, okay? And theoria implied contemplation, right? Okay. And one of the meanings, the original meanings of the Greek word theoria, okay, was not just the idea of anything reflective and contemplative. It also implied a particular visual-based contemplation of the world. Okay, and that's why it's not surprising that a lot of philosophers, in thinking thought, use the imagery of a theater, right? And because somewhere philosophizing, I mean the theoretical disposition that underlies philosophizing often is something that you want to make the abstract come alive, right? And the best way of making the abstract come alive is staging it like a drama, right? Etc. And in the original Greek sense, theory or theoria essentially meant some kind of a visual contemplation of the world, like in a theater or a drama or something of that kind. In fact, Einstein, one of the icons of modern science, actually called theories, right, as free creations of the human mind, right? And because they are free creations of the human mind, they can involve a lot of speculative elements, right, etc. Although Einstein himself did see the possibility of theories that can provide frameworks which enable us to make sense of the world in terms of certain rigidities, regularities, laws, and so on. But Einstein did recognize that there is often in the theoretical mindset a certain speculative disposition, although one must not give free vent to that speculative aspect of theory or theorizing. And there can and must be scientific theories which can provide frameworks which enable us to make sense of the world and so on in terms of certain protocols, whether it be laws or mechanisms or something of that kind. And we will be discussing some of this as we go along, right? Likewise, the term theory is often contrasted with practice, right? There is this famous saying, true in theory, right, but not in practice, right? So we want something to be true, not just in theory, but also true in practice, right? etc. Right? So somewhere along the way, there is a larger background or a larger discursive space in which the term theory and theorizing participates in, right? And I'm only giving you some sense of it, and a lot of my recent work has been actually trying to think about the relationship between theory and theory and inquiry in the context of of science, and for me, I think it's not just social sciences as different, etc. And so on. So I think there are so there is some larger space in which any discussion about the context of theory and theorizing can be addressed, right? And I mean, and it's a I mean, it's in a manner of speaking, it's a very overdetermined concept. Theory and theorizing are overdetermined concepts, and somewhere along the way, it's important to address the overdetermined aspects of theory and theorizing and so on. And I've just given you some sense of the overdeterminations that attach to the idea of theory, the word theory or the concept theory, and theorizing, and so on. But then, how do we still explore context of theory and theorizing, right? It's all the more important that we set up a certain alternative background for the ways in which we can discuss the context of theory and theorizing. Swedberg has suggested a context for exploring theory and theorizing for us on one argument, and I think in what we are trying to do is actually set up an alternative context for discussing theory and theorizing. Okay, and for that purpose, I work with some basic ideas, and I will take this discussion more systematically in the next class, but I will just initiate it for today, right? I mean, so if we have to, I mean, for our purposes, right, or for the purposes of our discussion in the context of this course and the kind of emphasis that we have been bringing all through so far, I think there are three features of what we may term as the traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing, right? And please note, I'm setting up a context, right? And I'm setting up a context by invoking a certain idea of a traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing, right? Please note, I will have some critical remarks to make in the coming classes on this traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing. Okay, but for the moment, there are three features that I am attributing to what I am terming a traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing. I mean, etc. Okay. Now we will ask critical questions of this view a little later as we proceed. Right. The first feature of the traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing, and I'm putting that within quotes, traditional scientific view, is that theory, right, is distinct from practice, although theory, okay, can be related to practice. Okay, so the first key element of the traditional scientific view is theory is distinct from practice, although there is, in operative terms, a relationship between theory and practice. But logically, there is a distinction between theory and practice. You can keep theory apart from practice, okay? Although in discussing practice fully, you need to take note of theory, and in discussing theory fully, you need to take note of practice. But theory and practice are distinct, albeit related to each other. That's the first ingredient, right? Etc. Second, theory, and please note, this is of course, you may say that I'm setting up a scapegoat, right? But that's a critical discussion we'll go along, because I'm going to raise questions both from within science and the social sciences about this traditional scientific view later, right? But let us first set up this discussion, which we will depart from as we proceed. Second feature of the traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing is that theories, even as they are distinct but related to practice, theories, the end of theory is to yield predictions, or if not predictions, at least explanations, right? Etc. In fact, one of the dominant ideas of explanation is the idea of causal explanations, and causal explanations explained through certain kinds of determinate procedures of establishing cause. And often it is argued that a full scientific explanation is the basis for a prediction, right? Etc. So the traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing not only adheres to a distinction between theory and practice, but also says that the purpose of theory or theorizing is to yield predictions, and explanations of phenomena, right? Etc. And thirdly, which follows from 1 and 2, theories can be judged as true or false. In other words, theories as explanations can be subjected to what I have called in the handout a test of bivalence, right? You test a theory for whether it is true or false. That if it is true, that means it is not false. If it is false, that means it cannot be true, right? So the bivalence is that that theories must be tested against facts, right? And if they don't account for the if theories don't account for the facts, then they are obviously false. And if theories can account for the facts, then they are obviously true. So there is there is some either or, involved in a test of bivalence, right? Etc. Right? And please note, again, I'm saying this is the traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing, although it is a kind of a caricature. We can all say that look, this picture of scientific theory and theorizing, what you're calling traditional, doesn't obtain in actual practice, right? It might be true, right? But there are elements of actual scientific practice which adhere to one or either of these components, right? Etc. And so somewhere we need to set up a conception of the traditional scientific view along the lines that I have suggested. So theory is distinct from practice, although related to practice. Theories yield explanations, predictions. Theories can be tested for being either true or false. They cannot be both true and false. The test of bivalence means that they are either true, or false. They cannot be both true and false, or something may be true for some time and it can get falsified at some other time, right? So the test of bivalence can recognize that something that is accepted as true at one point in time can get falsified in another point in time, right? Etc. But the test of bivalence is something that often is a hallmark of a kind of a rigid scientific view of theorizing and theory and theorizing. In the next class, I will go to looking at how do we respond, to this traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing, right? And I will break up my later discussion into two parts, where I will look at how can we respond to this traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing from within science itself, natural sciences itself, and outside of it, how do we respond to this traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing from within social sciences, right? Etc. And I think for me, the first part of the discussion is more important, because it's not as though this traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing is not contested within the domain of natural sciences themselves, right? Etc. So you don't need to go outside of science to criticize the traditional scientific view of theory and theorizing. It is critically responded to by interesting historians of science, etc. And of course, there is also a social scientific response that we can be looking at. And I will be taking that up in the next class. But I think the terms that I've set for you in this class are fairly lucid, I think, and clear. But if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to take them on, or general observations you want to make, you're free to do so. Any comments, any questions, any observations, any doubts? Right. So I'm taking for granted that everything is clear in this class. In this lecture, everything is clear, or maybe you will mull over it over time and come back on this. Okay, so shall I stop the recording?
Yes,
right,
sir.
I'll do that. Yeah. Yes, Raunak, you have a doubt?
Sir, actually, I have a few questions about this lecture, but I would like to actually, think about a little more and then continue in the beginning of the next class.
No. What did you say? I couldn't hear because your voice was dropping.
Sir, I'm saying that I have a few questions in mind, and I would like to think about them a little more and present them to you at the beginning of the next day's class.
Okay. You give it a thought, and
Yeah.
I'll take this. I can take it up. It's not necessary that I should take this on at the beginning of the next class. You can also do it towards the end of the next class, right? Because if it is in the beginning of the next class, then I may not start with the recording, because I see it's important to retain a certain flow in the recording, right? So Raunak, if you can raise these questions that you have in the latter part of our next class, then it will be, you can always invoke earlier things also in the context of your questions, right?
Yes, sir, whenever it's okay for you.
Right. So I'm just requesting that, because if it is in the start of the class, then the recording I may not do it like last time, as it were, right? If I can have questions which are kind of seamlessly built into the lecture, then when students hear it, it becomes a little more easier for them to comprehend. That's the only reason why I'm making this clarification, right? Okay. Any? Okay, so let me stop the recording.